Good afternoon, friends, and welcome to the EduSat Network. Our today's topic of discussion is community and civil society debate. And for this discussion, we have us in our studio Dr. Satish Kumar Jha, Associate Professor, Department of Political Science, Aryabhat College, University of Delhi. His area of specialization is Indian politics and political thought, and he has been teaching since the last 23 years. With this introduction, I'd like to welcome Sir to our EduSat studio. Thank you so much, Sir, for coming. And I also request you to begin our today's lecture.
Thank you, Madam Urvasi. In fact, today's discussion, we have decided to have on civil society and community debate in India. But there are two things which I would like to put up front here. One, that this debate is not confined to India, but it has global ramifications. Even in the Western countries, it has been a very important feature of contemporary social science debate. But in India, it has come with some sort of a baggage, in the sense that this community, revival of the community identity or the discourse surrounding this community is not new to India, but even in colonial period, when India was basically waging a fight against colonial rule, the entire nationalist politics revolved around certain categories in which community was a very important dimension of it. Now, but there is a difference, from what happened in the colonial period and what we witness today in the post-colonial period. And in this context, there is another significant development, that is the entire relationship between the civil society and the state, which is very central to any discourse on liberal democracy. That is also acquiring some new dimensions in recent times, and therefore this entire issue of community identity, issue of the community relationships, all that are becoming very important today. Now, before I move on to this issue of this community and community identity and the entire approach which is characterized as communitarian thinking, let us first of all see that how this issue of community identity and communitarian framework has come in light of a kind of crisis of the modern state. And this crisis of the modern state is not confined to India, but it is basically witnessed all over the world, particularly in the West and in the post-colonial societies, where the state was considered to be a very important instrument of social change and social transformation. Even this crisis is basically discussed and debated in context of the third world societies. So that way one can say that there is some sort of commonality between what is happening in the West and what is happening in the third world countries, post-colonial societies like India. But then there is a difference. Now the difference is that in the West this entire thing has emerged, the crisis of state, because of three important things, important developments. One was basically the tendency for authoritarianism in the political structure and political authority, and number two, the rise of totalitarian regimes in different parts of the world, and that led to kind of disenchantment with the modern state system, and therefore there was an urge for or quest for having intermediary structure in society through which people can express their minds, or through which they can basically protect their rights. So this intermediary structure was seen in terms of this structure of civil society. Now the civil society, as it is well known, is basically very cardinal principle of any idea or any debate on the state system. And the civil society, the concept of civil society has evolved in a long period of time in history, and the entire Western political thought is basically replete with ideas in which scholars like Locke, Rousseau, Hegel, and many others talked of the civil society, that how civil society is an important framework through which people's engagement with political power takes place. But what has happened in recent times, particularly in last 30 years, 20 to 30 years, that there is a disenchantment with the state and the revival of the civil society. Now this revival of the civil society has been largely on account of 2-3 factors. Number one, this enchantment with the state, but because of the hegemony project which it is believed to basically practice in the society, and number two, this specter of authoritarianism. These two things are considered to be very important in basically disenchanting people so far as the state authority or the power of the state is concerned. But along with that, there has also been a problem related to the delivery system, that the state has failed to deliver on some of the promises which it essentially made, and some of the promises were liberty, security, equality, justice, and so on and so forth. So these values, it is believed that a state has basically defaulted on that. And the third was that the democratic urge of the people has always materialized in terms of a kind of protest against the state authority, and they have tried to glamorize, or one can say that they have always tried to look at the civil society as a site for realization of their democratic rights and democratic aspirations. So one of the reasons for this disenchantment with the state and growing hope in the institutions of civil society can be seen in terms of this development. The second is that this Eastern Europe, which witnessed the socialist socialist regimes, their disintegration in 90s, and before the disintegration, the kind of totalitarian regimes which were in existence in those societies also led to a kind of reappraisal, or one can say that a kind of awakening, that why this type of development could take place in a regime which obviously was claiming to be a socialist regime. And reason invariably was seen in terms of the absence of the intermediary institutions or a structure in those societies in form of civil society. Therefore, it was believed that because of the absence of the civil society, because civil society is considered to be site of freedom, civil society is considered to be a site where people come together voluntarily through contract. There is a right to exit, there is a right to entry, and there are a number of features which characterize the civil society, and it was believed that these institutions, which should essentially define a civil society, were missing in Eastern Europe, and therefore there was a kind of this phenomenon of totalitarianism. So therefore it is also believed that unless you have a very vibrant and powerful civil society, there is always a possibility of a state becoming totalitarian and authoritarian. So therefore, in fact, civil society essentially gets linked to the entire democratic discourse, that if there is any hope for liberal democracy, then one has no other option but to think in terms of a very powerful, vibrant civil society in the political arena and the social arena. Now, the third reason for disenchantment, coming to the post-colonial societies like India, what we believe, what we feel, that in India this entire discourse of civil society has taken place in altogether different form. Because first of all, in India it is believed that the civil society emerged during colonial period, particularly when the Britishers introduced a kind of modernity here, which at times is called colonial modernity, because it was not a natural growth of the modern ideas in institutions, but they were implanted. But nonetheless they are modern because they resemble to some extent some of the processes and institutions of the West. But this colonial modernity which was introduced in India was also characterized by certain other things which were basically different from the trajectory of the West. And one of the important feature of this entire discourse, it is believed, was the kind of civil society which was created here. Because normally civil society is a site of freedom, civil society where people act as citizens, where they have rights, where they have basically they have different types of contractual relationships, where there are democratic processes, democratic sites of political activity. But in India, unfortunately, what happened is the way civil society came here, and the way civil society was basically organized and instituted during the colonial period, all these things were basically missing. People were there in the civil society, but not as citizens, but as subjects. So basically the subjecthood characterized Indian civil society, particularly during colonial period, not the citizenship and their rights. So in India, what happened, that this colonial trajectory of the construction of civil society was totally different. Now in post-colonial period, interestingly, what happened, that because the Indian state was considered the most important instrument to deliver on the promises which were made to the Indian people by the Indian nationalist movement, Indian national movement. And number two, it was believed that the Indian state would act in a very neutral and autonomous way. It will be above sectarian narrow class interests, and therefore it will be basically the ultimate realization of people's interests and aspirations in the state system. So this way, what we find that in the post-colonial period, that civil society, instead of civil society, it was a state which became the site of democratic aspirations and democratic process. Now, the post-colonial trajectory, we'll come to this issue, that how it was considered as an important site for democratic politics. It was considered an important site for egalitarian policies. It was considered important site for fulfilling people's aspirations and people's visions. But what happened, that gradually this autonomous neutral instrument called Indian state basically started deviating from its the promises, and that set in a kind of disillusionment among the people, and therefore in by 70s, late 60s or early 70s, you have a very powerful debate taking place in India in social science, saying that what is the nature of Indian state, whether the Indian people's democratic aspirations can be fulfilled and realized through the instrumentality of the state, or should we look for some alternative channels for fulfillment of those vision. So this debate took place in late 60s and early 70s, and therefore the entire framework which tried to look at Indian state as an autonomous institution, autonomous in the sense that it was above the narrow sectarian interests, and it was basically acting in the interest of all. Now that got interrogated. It was believed that the state no longer enjoyed that autonomy, and therefore you have to have alternative site for for a struggle, alternative site for politics, alternative site for movements, through which people's rights, their aspirations, and the entire constitutional commitments could be realized. So this way one can say that the Indian debate in 80s, in 70s, 80s, and also in 90s, to some extent one can say that is basically gets synchronized with what was happening in the West. Of course the regions were different, as I have mentioned, that in West it emerged on two counts. Number one, the disenchantment with the state because of this rise of totalitarianism, and number two, the kind of development which took place in Eastern Europe and absence of civil society as an intermediary structure between the people and the state, and therefore a realization among the people that unless you have this intermediary structure to basically mediate and negotiate with the state authority, in fact the democratic rights and democratic structure can never be made secure. So this was the development in the West, but in the Indian context the development has been a little bit different. Now I have also mentioned that the delivery issue was there in the West also, that the state was not a sufficiently equipped institution to deliver so far as the citizenship entitlements are concerned, and therefore there was a kind of subtext in the entire thing that one has to look beyond the state for basically fulfillment of one's entitlements and one's aspirations. So this way one can say that this debate has been going on. Now in light of all this, what we find that there is a revival of this entire concept of civil society, the idea surrounding civil society, and the entire politics which takes place within the civil society. So much so that even in recent years, we have seen last 5 to 6 years in India, that there is a very powerful, vibrant new social movement going on. To some extent, it wants to, complement, or to some extent it wants to fill the gaps which exist in the political discourse in India, and therefore it believes that a civil society has to play a very important role in the democratic life of the people. It is not that only state can be given the full authority and the full right to decide that what are the democratic aspirations of the people, but rather people should take upon themselves, and therefore it is believed that the way the Indian Constitution talks of we the people of India, that means the kind of popular sovereignty which the Constitution creates in India basically puts an onus on the civil society to see that how the political authority legitimately functions in the interest of the people. So therefore, in fact, in recent years we have seen this type of development taking place, particularly on issues like anti-corruption movement and many other movements which have taken place, and they are sometimes called new social movements. Now recently this gets associated with this Anna Hazare movement which happened 2-3 years ago, when the entire movement was for the institution of Lokpal, but nonetheless it was also a movement in which it was consistently argued that the civil society and its agencies are as important as a state. They have the same legitimacy as a state because they have a constitutional sanction, because the Constitution talks of we the people of India, and therefore creates a popular sovereignty. And popular sovereignty lies not in the state, but popular sovereignty lies in the civil society. It is not only during elections and through election that this sovereignty can be secured, or can be seen, but it is a continuous process, because the people and their rights and their effort to basically see that the commitments of the Constitution are fulfilled by the state. This has to be a continuous process, and therefore civil society is an important agency through which India's democratic discourse has to move forward. So this was the argument we have seen in recent years taking place. But in spite of all these developments, what we find that in India, this debate sometimes gets polarized between two different type of point of views. One point of view which basically looks at this civil society as a legal rational institution, a kind of intermediary structure between the state and the people, and therefore there are many agencies which are considered to be the agencies of civil society, which are modern agencies. They are considered to be supplementary agencies. They supplement the efforts of the state in its endeavor to fulfill the commitments, constitutional commitments. Now, so therefore this is one usage we invariably find, and this usage to some extent one can say is basically in consonance with what liberal political theory talks of, whether it is basically Locke or Rousseau or Hegel, or for that matter any eminent Western political thinker. When he talked of civil society, it was invariably used in these terms, the legal rational terms. And the most celebrated idea, most celebrated view on this type of civil society one can find in Tocqueville, who wrote a book Democracy in America, and where he argued that how American democracy has been bolstered through these associational institutions or associational life of the people in the civil society, and therefore he considered that those societies which didn't have such associational institutions, the foundation for democracy was always weak. So this is one usage. This is the legal rational usage of civil society. In India also you find that there are a lot of scholars, social scientists, sociologists, who have been using civil society purely in these terms. When they talk of substituting the state, or if not substituting, supplementing the state or complementing the state through the initiative of the civil society, they essentially talk of this legal rational framework. One important name comes to my mind is Andre Bethe, the sociologist, who has consistently argued for this sort of intermediary institution. But at the same time, they also argue that these institutions need autonomy from the state. And much of the problem, in their opinion, happens today largely because of the erosion of their autonomy. Because the state has basically interfered in their functioning, in their working, and therefore they have lost their autonomy. And because of the loss of that autonomy, these institutions are becoming moribund. They are not in a position to basically act as the channel for mediation between the citizens and the state, and therefore they argue that the only way a liberal democratic project in India can be made more secure, can be made more vibrant, can be made more effective is to give autonomy to these institutions. When they talk of these institutions, they essentially mean institutions like university, these institutions like hospitals, club, libraries, all these institutions in the civil society, where the nature of membership is voluntary, associational, contractual. It is not ascriptive, it is not given, like the other institutions, like one can say the caste, community, ethnic group, etc. and etc. So these are the agencies where people enter voluntarily, willingly, in well considered judgment. They feel that these are the associations, these are the forums through which they can basically chart out a new course for themselves and for the society. So I mean, these are the institutions which in their opinion are the institutions of civil society, and they are basically the backbone of liberal democracy, because these are the institutions where citizens and their rights are made secure. It is these institutions where people become citizens, because there the essential values of liberty, equality, fraternity and justice, the cherished values of human beings in modern times, those values are realized. And it is these institutions, they believe that if they function autonomously, then they are not only a kind of asset to the peoples and their lives, but they are also an asset to the modern liberal institutions and the liberal state, because they are the only channels through which peoples which can really mediate between the people and the state. So this is one sort of usage of the civil society. But then there is another usage of the civil society which is also seen, and this usage is also common among both political scientists, sociologists, historians, so on and so forth. And this usage is not one which talks of legal rational structure, but it talks of the traditional moral ordering of community relationships. In fact, what is argued here when the civil society is talked of, is basically a reference to the community structures. The community structures which are not modern but traditional, but nonetheless they exist in the society, and it is these institutions through which people in a society like India basically try to work in their political and social life. So it is believed that these institutions may be traditional, but they are the real institutions through which people's lives are shaped and determined, and therefore these institutions have to be taken in a different light, in the sense that they are not only those institutions which should be whisked away. These are not only, these institutions should not be looked at as in a transitory or a pre-modern and therefore doesn't have any role to play in modern settings. Rather, they would argue that these institutions are the institutions, even in modern settings, they can provide a very important site for people's realization of their values, people's realization of their aspirations, and they can also be important tool for entire democratic process and democratic discourse in India. So we find that there are these two different uses of the civil society is quite common in Indian context. Now, before I move on to the second stream, which is normally associated with the communitarian thinking in India, and the communitarianism, which is basically a worldwide phenomenon, but in India it has made a powerful presence through the ideas and writings which have surfaced in last 20 to 30 years, and there are many people, many scholars, many social scientists who have contributed in this. There are few names which can be mentioned here: Ashish Nandi, Partha Chatterjee, T.N. Madan, J.P.S. Oberoi. To some extent, one can also associate Rajni Kothari, particularly his writings in late 70s and 80s, when he was critiquing the Indian state and was arguing that Indian state has lost autonomy from the dominant interests, and therefore Indian state is trying to impose its hegemony, cultural hegemony on the people, and he started looking for alternative sites in terms of non-political process, in terms of the civil society activities, so on and so forth. So basically he was also in the same company, of course with some differences, because he was not totally dismissive of modern legal rational institutions which are basically the central to the entire civil society concept in liberal democracy. But nonetheless, the other sociologists or psychologists whom I mentioned just now, Nandi, Madan, Oberoi and others, and including Chatterjee, Partha Chatterjee in later writings, so they are basically the important voices so far as Indian communitarianism is concerned. But we will come to that issue later. But first of all, this entire thing of the Indian debate on civil society and community has to be seen in context of the gradual historical evolution of this entire the debate and entire concept. For example, as I mentioned, that this colonial period, this colonial modernity created kind of institutions, the kind of processes which deviated from the Western counterpart, and therefore in India what happened, the civil society of course was integral to this colonial project of modernity, but nonetheless the civil society was also a site where basically the elites, those who were familiar with the terms of colonial modernity, they were basically working, or they were visible, or they were present. But the ordinary people, the Indian masses who didn't have much exposure to the modernity and modern ideas, they were excluded from the civil society. So to some extent one can say the colonial period, the civil society didn't connote a kind of mass society, but rather one can say that it connoted something elitist society of the period. That elites and their ideas, the modern institutions and processes, they became integral to this entire concept of civil society. Now the evolution of civil society, as I mentioned, that has also been different from the West, now, largely because of the differential movement of capital, because the way the capitalism grew in India and the way the capitalism grew in the West, there was a big difference between the two processes. And number two, this capital, differential impact of capital had its repercussions or implications for the construction of civil society as well, because civil society to some extent, as Karl Marx used to say, that is a realm of economy, the market, and so on and so forth. So in other words, one can say that the emergence of civil society is closely tied with the emergence of capitalism. Of course it is tied with modernity, but the modernity and capitalism cannot be separated from each other. So therefore what happened, that because in India the rise of capitalism was taking a different route, and therefore the construction of civil society in India was also completely different from the way it happened in the West from 16th century onwards. And that's why with the rise of capitalism, with the rise of modernity, and the Western thinkers reflecting on this kind of process, and that how civil society state entire framework emerged in the Western political thought from Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau to Hegel, and so on and so forth. So this way one can say that in India there is a clear cut and visible difference between what we find in terms of the civil society. Now what happened, that nationalism in this context, the national movement becomes very important. What happened, that the civil society was basically a terrain through which the colonial state and the Indian elites, who were to some extent collaborating with the Indian colonial state at that time, they were operating. Therefore, the national movement tried to carve out a different sphere for its political activity. So civil society didn't become the central site for nationalist activity. Rather, the alternative sites were looked for, searched for, and created. And that alternative sites invariably became the site of community identity, the community framework, which was basically outside the civil society. And the best example is Gandhi. When Gandhi started, his political activity in India, he tried to mobilize resources from tradition. He tried to mobilize resources from the community framework. He tried to basically look towards the traditional structures, traditional bondings, because he thought that the colonial state and the colonial modernity could be challenged not through the agency of the civil society or on the terrain of the civil society, but outside the terrain of it. And therefore, this community identity became the central to the entire nationalist politics and nationalist discourse at that time. And that streak has been continuing. Therefore, in fact, when it is believed that the tradition and modernity, this dichotomy is posited, it is believed that the modern institutions invariably lead to the erosion of traditional structures, and the traditional structures have to be replaced if there is really any forward move in direction of modern liberal democracy and progress. Then it is believed that in Indian context there is a need for some modifications, because the traditional structures have traditionally played very important role for basically articulation of people's interests and people's aspirations. And therefore, this streak of Indian nationalism, where traditional bondings, the entire thing was anchored in traditional structure, and that thing has been continuing even today. And therefore, either you call them communitarians, or you call them the critique of modernity, or you call them alternativists, like Nandi, Oberoi, Madan, others, and they always believe that the post-colonial trajectory is different from the Western trajectory, and therefore, when we talk of liberal democracy, we have to have certain different framework to understand this process. We'll come to this issue later, particularly with reference to Partha Chatterjee and his concept of political society, that how he differentiates between civil society and political society. And he believes that civil society is the terrain of modernity and political society is the terrain of democracy. If the transformation, the social transformation in colonial period was transformation in terms of modernity, the transformation in the post-colonial period is in terms of democracy. So democracy and modernity, they are posited against each other. Civil society and political society are posited against each other. One stands for modernity, another stands for democracy. And it is believed that in the post-colonial period, in today's context, the democratic politics in India cannot be understood unless one tries to understand this process of political society. So this is his contribution in the entire debate on community civil society in Indian context. But we will come to this issue later. But before that, we have to keep in mind that this post-colonial period, that nationalism on the one hand tried to carve out a different sphere for its political activity, and that sphere didn't strictly resemble with the civil society in the way we understand it in Western context. And therefore, what will happen that there was always in fact an attempt to kind of seek autonomy for certain structures in the social sphere, those structures which they thought that were not were not to be exposed to the colonial law and colonial power. And therefore, even if the Indian nationalists tried to invite the colonial interventions so far as the social evils or the social practices were concerned, whether sati or widowed marriage and so on and so forth, still they considered there certain areas which were so sacrosanct that they didn't want any intervention in that sphere. And this is what Partha Chatterjee calls the inner and the outer sphere of the nationalist self. That in outer sphere they wanted to basically get engaged, or they wanted to to get associated with the colonial power and move in direction of modern progress. But inner structure they always wanted to keep autonomous from this entire process. So this nationalist thing created this sphere which was outside civil society, where the community was a very important consideration. Now what happened that after independence, after 1947, Indian state the way Indian state was visualized and the way Indian state was conceptualized becomes important here to see that how this civil society debate was looked at. Now 1947 onwards, the entire liberal democratic project was basically handed over to the state authority, state power, the state institutions, and the civil society became subservient to the state. And as I have mentioned, that political scientists like Rajni Kothari, who came out with important innovative idea to explain this Indian process of democratization through Congress system and intermediary regime, intermediate regime, and so on and so forth. In fact, they argued that in Indian context, because the situation has been different from the West, therefore the state has to be seen in a different light, and therefore here the civil society also has to perform a different role. So instead of looking towards civil society as site of freedom, people started looking towards the state as a site of freedom and rights, and the state became the agency for transformation. Now this disillusionment, as I was mentioning, came only 30-40 years down the line, when it was believed that it was not competent enough to deliver on its promises. And number two, some of the political scientists also started arguing that a state, as it was believed earlier, that would act autonomously in a neutral fashion, would be above narrow interests. The sectional interest was basically, those hopes were belied, and the state became subservient to certain interests in the society, the dominant interests. So instead of becoming the instrument of social change, it started catering to the needs of the elites. And therefore, the elites and mass distinction came in the society in a big way, and a state could not function autonomously from this contradiction. And therefore, this erosion of what was called the erosion of Nehruvian consensus and the erosion of state autonomy in India. And therefore, what is believed that in India, a kind of the politics which was characterizing Indian democracy, that politics suffered a big blow, and the entire democratic project also was practically on verge of derailment. And therefore, what was argued that all these things led to a kind of tendency towards authoritarianism and totalitarianism, the kind of tendencies which we have discussed in context of the West, not in Eastern Europe, but in other parts of the world. And therefore, in 70s, what happened? That you had a powerful movement for democratization, you had a powerful movement for people's rights, you had a powerful movement against growing authoritarianism of the state. And the best example here is 1975 to 77, the total revolution of Jayaprakash Narayan, who tried to basically highlight the maladies of the Indian state and try to highlight that how this authoritarianism is now taking or replacing the earlier democratic face of the Indian state. So this was the time that when we feel that again in India, it was believed that it is not solely the state authority through which people can seek their fulfillment of their aspirations, but rather one should also try to look towards those intermediary institutions and structures which are called civil society, because in absence of the civil society, the state will always move in direction of authoritarianism and totalitarianism. And therefore, that was the new quest for creating this civil society in India. Now here we find that number of developments taking place. Now many human rights organizations came up. People's Union for Democratic Rights, People's Union for Civil Liberty. Number of civil society institutions came and became active for people's rights. So what happened that 70s you have the new beginning of this new quest to further deepen this Indian democratic process by creating this intermediary structure called civil society, about which it was believed that would not be required in India, because the state itself was basically amalgamation of, or rather a culmination of various types of interests, and the state was the custodian, the guardian, one can say, a kind of the main protector and benefactor of the people. But it was believed that it would be too much if we basically hand over the entire thing to the state structure and state authority, and therefore you have to look for some alternative channels for democratic negotiations and democratic engagement, and the civil society became one of those. Now, this was the time when you find that civil society institutions are basically coming in their own, and we have number of associations, institutions, processes, movements. One can say the non-governmental organization it was called, or non-party political process one can say, as Rajni Kothari called at that time, and that these were the characteristics of this phase. But simultaneously, we should also feel that when this was being used at that time, it was essentially being used as a legal rational terms, the way the civil society has been understood in the West. But later on, the 80s, we find that another streak or another tendency developed. Again, the basically reason for this type of new thinking or new interrogation was more or less same: disillusionment with the state and disenchantment with the state. It was the erosion of the legitimacy of the state. But basically, the way this entire alternative vision was talked of, the way alternative vision was basically conceptualized, it was completely different from the one which was being talked of within this legal rational framework. And it is here that we can see the revival, or not revival, but one can say that the rise of the Indian communitarianism in the social science and in politics. Thus, Indian communitarianism to some extent is different from Western communitarianism. Now, when you talk of communitarianism implies a kind of political movement, a kind of political discourse which has emerged within liberal democracy, within liberal political theory in the West, particularly in Canada, United States, and many other countries. But in Indian context, this communitarianism to some extent is different from what was happening in the West. It was not strictly informed by the ideas of the liberal political theory of the West. Rather, it has its own indigenous roots. And as I have mentioned, those roots can be traced to the colonial period, to the national movement, the way the nationalist elites tried to counter the colonial modernity, the way the Indian constitution to some extent recognizes some of these structures, even if it talks of a modern liberal democracy, it is not totally dismissive of those traditional bondings or traditional structures or traditional institutions. So this way Indian communitarianism emerges on the scene, and that creates a new type of debate in India between the community civil society. That civil society, what is the meaning of civil society? What does it imply? Civil society means only modern institutions which are outside the state, outside the sphere of the state, which are the intermediary in nature, where the relationship is contractual, which is associational, and so on and so forth, and they have nothing to do with the traditional or the communitarian frameworks in the society. Or civil society means not only the modern institutions but also traditional bondings. And it is here that the Indian communitarians have argued rather very forcefully that the Indian context, these traditional community frameworks are basically the backbone of the civil society. Because if you talk of civil society, then we have to basically talk about those structures. Because it is those structures which can protect people's rights. It is those structures through which people can deepen their democratic engagement. Not only widen but rather deepen. They provide the meaning to people's life, democratic life, and therefore those structures cannot be basically whisked away. So much so that it is also argued that secularism as a state policy, a kind of ideology of the state and its institutions, in fact is not enough to create a tolerant society in India. Rather, the tolerant society can be created only by anchoring it within the framework of traditional moral structure, traditional moral bondings. That is, caste, community, ethnicity and religion. So I mean, for example, one of the most important name here is Ashish Nandi. In fact, he wrote a paper called Anti-Secular Manifesto, and that manifesto he clearly mentions, in fact, not only Nandi, but even Partha Chatterjee's Secularism and Tolerance. There is another important paper where he has argued that how this tolerance, the secularism, the way it is practiced by the Indian state has not been able to create a tolerant society, and therefore if we really need a tolerant society, then we have to look beyond it, and that beyond means that we have to look towards these community structures and community framework. Now, so this way, these communitarians have tried to basically posit this community against the civil society. Now, it is here there are 2-3 things we should remember. That number one, when they bring in this entire issue of community against civil society, they they try to critique modernity, particularly Western modernity, and they believe that Western modernity cannot be institutionalized in Indian context in the same way. Therefore, you have to have a different framework. Number two, they basically posit democracy against modernity. They believe that they might have emerged simultaneously, but the way they are basically working in Indian context, there is a contradiction between the two. The democratic ideas, the democratic channels, democratic aspirations of the people are in basically conflict with the modern institutions, because the modern institutions, the modern ideas are only catering to the needs of the elites, those who are well off, who was minority, minuscule minority. They are basically conversant with the rules of the modern institutions. But the masses, the people, the subaltern classes it is called, the oppressed sections, the women, the minorities, the ethnic groups, they are basically outside this framework of both modernity and modern institutions, and to some extent one can say civil society. And therefore, they have no other channel but only the traditional channels to basically look for their protection, look for the realization of their rights. And therefore, they believe that this democracy and modernity, this contradiction in Indian context has to be resolved. Then only a true democratic project in India can be thought of. Now, that is another thing. The third thing is there is a concept of indigenous nature of these frameworks, or indigeneity in this idea of community. They believe that what is called modern is alien to the Indian people, but what is the community is basically a more indigenous thing. People are more conversant, more familiar with these things, and therefore their familiarity basically makes them a more convenient vehicle for the fulfillment of their aspirations and their interests. So that is another thing. The next thing, they try to highlight that this community identity is basically the identity through which people's political consciousness is channelized, and therefore they are the only way through which the way the talk of American democracy and the associational life of the people and the civil society institutions. They believe that in Indian context, these are the agencies through which people's aspirations and their interests are basically taken care of. People's entire consciousness, they are the vehicle of people's political consciousness. So therefore, they feel that instead of being dismissive of these traditional moral frameworks of people in the society called community and its identity, it is to be taken seriously, and they can act as the true medium of people's fulfillment of their interests. Now, what is happening that in context of all these debate, the two things are very important here. Number one, that this entire communitarian attempt is to basically to interrogate the state for its hegemony project. Number two, for imposing the kind ideas of the elites on the masses. And number three, basically bringing modernity in such a manner that the entire democratic project is sabotaged. So therefore, they believe that if democratic project is to be retrieved or is extricated from from this stranglehold and is to be put on the path of more vibrancy, then one has to look for alternative resources, and those resources are available in society, not in the state, and not even in the civil society in modern sense of the term, the way it is being used in legal rational framework. So this is how this entire debate has gained momentum in recent years. Now it is in this context that we believe that some of the criticisms of these communitarians are also equally important. It is believed that these communitarians on the one hand argue that secularism has failed to institute tolerance in society. The kind of modern institutions are not being able to fulfill the democratic promises, and therefore these things are to be seen in the communitarian framework of the people, of the society, the community identity, and so on and so forth. But it is also argued that they completely overlook there are certain other aspects of this community life. The community life is always mediated by caste, class and gender, but they do not take into account these mediations. Number two, if the state leads to exclusion of the people, of the masses, then this civil society in this communitarian sense is also exclusionary. For example, it doesn't include everyone. For example, often the example is cited of some of the traditional, associational structures like khap panchayats and so on and so forth. So they say that they are also exclusionary. That this is not based on contract but rather ascriptive. And there are certain authoritarian, tendencies in these structures. But when these communitarians try to glorify these structures as structures which are basically kind of future potential, have the future potential for democratization of society, they completely gloss over this fact that there are also instances of exclusion. They try to glorify everyday life, the resources of everyday life, the tolerance through societal resources, but they don't basically realize that there are also a lot of violence, a lot of exclusions in everyday life in the society. So it is argued that these communitarians, while interrogating the state, its hegemony project, is attempt to impose the culture and ideology of the dominant on the people, they basically go to the other extreme and try to glorify the traditional structures, because they feel that only in traditional structures, that is the community, whether it is a caste identity or the community or the religion or ethnic group, it is only in those identities and ideologies that they believe that the true potential for democratization lies. But at the same time, as I have argued, that the critics point out that they completely gloss over there are certain instances of exclusion, violence, authoritarianism, which are basically latent in those structures. So that is one. But in this context, recently a very interesting argument has been put forth by Partha Chatterjee, and that is his idea of political society. Now Partha Chatterjee argues that this political society, because civil society is the site of transformation in modern context and in the Western context. He says that even in colonial period, one can say that the transformation was basically civil society was playing very important role. But in the post-colonial context, he said that with the category of civil society, one would not be able to understand the entire crux of entire process of social transformation and political transformation in post-colonial society like India. Because he believes that in post-colonial society like India, it is not the civil society where the transformations are taking place. They are not the sites of political transformation, but rather the political society which is the site of true transformation. Now, how he differentiates the civil society and political society is equally important. He says that civil society is basically stands for modernity, whereas the political society stands for democracy. In civil society, people's identity is the identity of a citizen, whereas in political society the identity of people is of population, not citizens. And another important characteristic is say that civil society thinks are basically organized, or basically the entire politics takes place within the framework of law and constitutionalism, whereas in political society the entire thing operates on the basis of lawlessness and something which is beyond constitution and law. But interestingly, he says that people in India and post-colonial societies, they feel that only outside the law and outside the framework of constitution and those rights which are guaranteed there, in fact they can negotiate with the state authority, and that negotiation takes place in political society through the mediation of agencies like parties, non-governmental organizations, voluntary associations, and so on and so forth. Whereas in civil society, the agencies for mediation are different. And in Partha Chatterjee's words, the political society is the society through which people are basically trying to chart out their democratic politics, and it is here that the state also mediates and negotiates with the people, not as the citizens but as a population. So therefore, this new category of political society to understand the democratic process in India given by Partha Chatterjee adds a new dimension to this entire debate of community civil society, that how Indian context, not the civil society as understood in the classical Western sense of liberal political theory, that one can see the true democratic politics taking place, but only through the category of political society which is a post-colonial construction. It is basically construction because of the differential nature of the movement of capital and community, that one can see that this concept of political society becomes very convenient to understand the democratic process. So this way we can say that this community civil society debate is going on, and there are many new ideas which are emerging, and attempt is being made to see that how they can be used to understand the entire democratic project in India.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for this very interesting presentation and all this talk and the facts that you shared with us, sir. And just a quick question, sir. I wanted to ask you, this says that you talked about civil society and community debate. Of course, it's a debate that is continually changing. New things are being added.
That's right.
Of course, it's not a static concept in that sense. So, how should one update oneself with respect to this debate?
In fact, because as I mentioned, the debate is an ongoing debate. In fact, every now and then we find that new ideas are coming. But nonetheless, as I mentioned, there are 4 or 5 important eminent social scientists in India who have been consistently writing on this, and their writings are available in different journals and books. So best way is to see some of their writings. For example, I mentioned Ashish Nandi, T.N. Madan, J.P.S. Oberoi, Andre Bete, Partha Chatterjee, Rajni Kothari. These are the 5-6 names. And then there are if someone want to see a good review of these ideas, where the ideas given by all of them are summarized, I think that there's a very interesting book by Shara Joseph, Indian Communitarianism. So I think that book, published by the SAGE India publication, I think that book can also be accessed. But nonetheless, it is always a pleasure reading these writers in original, because they're very lucid and they're very forceful in their argument.
Right. Thank you so much, sir, for that. And of course, you've provided us an exhaustive list of writers and also books as well. So that will be very useful for our students and our viewers who are watching. So continue in order to update themselves about what is happening with respect to the civil society and community debate. So once again, sir, thank you so much for being here, and we expect and also request you to be associated with us on future occasions and be here for more lectures. So with that, I'd like to bring this to a close and thank our viewers. Thank you and have a wonderful day ahead.